My sister said in front of the family that she was expecting a child from my husband. Expecting me to cry, but with a smile I made a toast and revealed a secret that made their world crumble. Jessica Miller had always been the type of woman who moved through life with quiet elegance. At 32 years old, she lived in a restored brownstone in Boston's South End, a home that had belonged to her late grandmother and which now stood as a symbol of tradition and stability in her life. Her days were measured, calm, filled with structure, morning walks with her dog, a cup of chamomile tea before work, and evenings spent reading or enjoying dinner with her husband, Michael. On the surface, everything about Jessica's life appeared enviable. Michael, her husband of 7 years, was a corporate attorney with an impressive track record. To family and friends, they were the epitome of a successful couple, two individuals who had seemingly found their rhythm, moving together through life's highs and lows without much turbulence. Jessica had always prided herself on cultivating not just a stable marriage, but a life that others could look to as aspirational. That illusion, carefully constructed, would soon begin to crack. It was the second Saturday in April, and the Miller household was abuzz with excitement. Jessica's parents, Ronald and Deborah, were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary, a milestone that carried immense meaning for their close-knit family. Traditionally, this event was celebrated with an intimate dinner at their home, a warm 2-story house in Newton with a garden that always seemed to bloom perfectly in time for spring. This year, Jessica had offered to host the dinner herself, turning her home into a backdrop for the celebration. It was her way of honoring the couple who had taught her what she once believed love should look like. By 5 o'clock in the evening, the table had been set, candles were lit, and the scent of rosemary chicken filled the house. The clinking of wine glasses and the gentle hum of laughter created a harmony that only years of family traditions could produce. Jessica floated between the kitchen and the dining room, ensuring every detail was perfect, from the folded linen napkins to the carefully selected playlist of soft jazz playing in the background. Her younger sister, Madison, arrived late, as usual. At 27, Madison was everything Jessica wasn't: spontaneous, loud, and perpetually at the center of attention. Dressed in a tight emerald green dress that seemed more fit for a cocktail bar than a family dinner, she kissed their mother loudly on the cheek and laughed in that exaggerated way she had perfected. Jessica noted her entrance without comment, offering her a glass of wine as if they hadn't been quietly drifting apart for months. As everyone took their seats, Ronald raised his glass to begin a toast. His voice, still strong despite his age, carried with it the gravity of decades of shared memories. "To Deborah, the love of my life, and to the family we built together," he began. The room echoed with soft applause and the gentle clink of crystal glasses. Jessica looked at Michael, who smiled and placed a hand on her thigh under the table, a gesture that once might have comforted her, but now felt strangely performative. Throughout dinner, conversations danced between past vacations, childhood anecdotes, and light teasing about old family habits. Jessica played her part effortlessly, laughing when appropriate, guiding the conversations away from awkward silences, and making sure everyone's glass stayed full. It was, by all appearances, a picture-perfect evening. No one could have guessed that beneath her composed exterior, Jessica had spent weeks rehearsing for what was to come. Because tonight wasn't just about her parents' anniversary. Jessica had chosen this evening, this gathering, for a reason. She had known for some time that secrets were being kept from her, secrets that everyone assumed she was too naive or too trusting to uncover. But Jessica was neither. She was watching. Waiting. And tonight, the mask of her perfect life would begin to fall, not by her hand, but by someone else's. The first sign of the evening's unraveling came in a glance. Jessica noticed Michael stiffen slightly when Madison laughed a little too loudly at one of his jokes. Her hand had lingered a moment too long on his shoulder as she passed behind him. Jessica said nothing. Her gaze returned to her plate as she sliced her roasted carrots with meticulous precision. Later, as dessert was being served, a lemon tart Jessica had made from scratch, the moment finally arrived. Madison stood up, glass in hand, her eyes scanning the table as if seeking permission for what she was about to do. "Before we continue," she began, her voice bright and confident, "I have something to say." Jessica's spine straightened ever so slightly. Around the table, heads turned. Ronald raised a curious eyebrow. Deborah smiled in that supportive, maternal way. Even Michael looked up, though the lines around his mouth had tightened. Jessica knew, even before the words were spoken, what was coming. She had known it would be tonight. She had known Madison couldn't resist making it public. Madison needed attention the way some people needed air. "I'm pregnant," Madison declared, placing her free hand dramatically over her abdomen. A few startled gasps broke the silence. And, she paused, her eyes fixed on Jessica now. "Michael is the father." It was as if all the air had been sucked from the room. Time slowed. Forks froze midway between plate and mouth. Deborah's hand flew to her chest. Ronald leaned forward, as if he hadn't heard correctly. And all eyes, every single one of them, turned to Jessica. They expected tears. Shouting. An emotional breakdown. Jessica, after all, had always been the quiet one, the composed one. Surely this would break her. But Jessica simply smiled. Calmly. Without a trace of panic, she lifted her own glass. "To the truth," she said softly, her voice clear and unwavering. "And to timing, the one thing that always brings everything to light." And with that, she took a sip of her wine. The silence was deafening. No one knew what to say. Madison blinked, clearly caught off guard. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jessica set her glass down gently. "Please," she said, her tone polite but firm, "don't go anywhere. I have something to show you." The storm had just begun. No one moved. The words still hovered in the air like a noxious fog, impossible to ignore, impossible to deny. Madison stood there, wine glass still in hand, her posture oddly triumphant, as though she'd just performed a courageous act rather than detonated a bomb in the middle of her family. The table, moments before alive with warmth and nostalgia, now felt like the cold surface of a courtroom where each person had been called to witness something they never wanted to see. Jessica remained standing as well, her eyes scanning the room with clinical detachment. She wasn't surprised by Madison's announcement, not because she had expected the exact words, but because the pattern had become so familiar. Madison had always chosen chaos over peace, disruption over harmony, and drama over discretion. The only thing Jessica had not known was how public her sister would choose to make her betrayal. Michael had gone pale. He hadn't said a word yet, and that silence was beginning to echo louder than any confession. Jessica noticed the twitch in his jaw, the slight tremor in his left hand as it gripped the stem of his glass. He looked at Madison now, not with affection, but with something between panic and disbelief, as though her declaration had caught him just as off guard. "Are you serious right now?" Their mother's voice, trembling and sharp, shattered the silence. Deborah had pushed back from the table, her napkin falling to the floor unnoticed. Her eyes bounced between her two daughters, seeking some kind of misunderstanding, some clue that this was all a terrible joke. "Tell me this isn't true." "It's true," Madison said, her voice a strange mix of defiance and vulnerability. "I'm not going to hide it anymore." "Hide it?" Ronald repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "You mean to tell us you've known this for some time?" Madison hesitated, and for a moment, the confident mask cracked. "A few months," she murmured. "But I couldn't say anything until I was sure." Michael shifted in his seat, finally speaking. "Madison, we were never, that's not how we agreed to," he stopped himself, too late. The damage was done. Jessica's eyes met his for a single, long second. He tried to read something in her gaze, fury, betrayal, heartbreak, but all he found was distance. She wasn't playing the game anymore. She had already walked off the board. Deborah rose from her chair, placing both hands on the table as if trying to steady herself. "How could you do this to your sister?" she whispered, looking directly at Madison. "To this family?" "I didn't plan it," Madison said quickly. It just happened. Michael and we didn't mean to fall for each other. But it's real. And I'm carrying his child. Ronald stood up now too. His hands were clenched at his sides, and though he didn't speak, the fury in his eyes said enough. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jessica broke it with grace. I said I had something to show you, she reminded them gently, walking over to the sideboard near the window. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small leather case. No one spoke as she placed it on the table and carefully unzipped it. From inside, she withdrew a slim folder, the edges crisp and neatly aligned. She handed a copy to each person at the table except Madison and Michael. What is this? Deborah asked, brows furrowed as she scanned the first page. Proof, Jessica said softly, returning to her seat. Of what's been happening for the last year. Maybe longer. Ronald squinted at the document, then suddenly reached for his reading glasses. A moment later, his jaw tightened. Bank statements. And text messages, Jessica added. And a few photographs. I hired a private investigator once I realized something wasn't right. Michael leaned forward, his voice rising in desperation. This is absurd. You've been spying on me. No, Jessica replied calmly. I've been protecting myself. I started noticing things last fall. Inconsistent travel receipts. Cash withdrawals that didn't make sense. And the phone bills, you really should have gotten a burner, Michael. Your messages to Madison were on the shared plan. Deborah covered her mouth. Madison tried to speak but faltered. Jessica continued, her tone steady but merciless. What you didn't realize, Madison, is that while you were sending flirtatious messages and planning secret rendezvous, you were also being watched. The camera in the backyard? It doesn't just catch footage of raccoons. Madison's face drained of color. There are photos, Jessica said. Of you arriving late at night. Leaving early in the morning. And before you even try to deny it, I've timestamped them all. Michael pushed his chair back violently, the screech of the legs against the hardwood sharp and jarring. This is insane, he said. You're just doing this to humiliate us. Jessica didn't flinch. No, Michael. I'm doing this to make it stop. You both tried to turn this into a performance, Madison with her announcement, you with your silence. But I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to scream. I'm going to let the facts speak for themselves. Ronald slammed his palm against the table, the sound echoing through the room. You cheated on your wife with her sister, he said to Michael, voice low and venomous. And you, he turned to Madison, you destroyed your own family for what? For him. Madison opened her mouth, but Jessica held up a hand. I'm not here to punish anyone, she said. This isn't revenge. This is revelation. Why now? Deborah asked. Why tonight? Jessica looked around the table, her expression unreadable. Because I wanted you all to see it clearly. Not just what happened, but how I handled it. How I chose dignity over destruction. No one dared to respond. Jessica stood again, folding her hands in front of her. I filed for divorce 3 days ago, she said. The paperwork is already in motion. But I needed this moment. Not for closure, I don't believe in that. I needed it for clarity. For you to see who you've been protecting. Who you've been enabling. Michael's eyes widened. You filed for divorce without even telling me? Yes, Jessica replied. Just like you lied to me without even hesitating. The room was still. Every word had landed like a stone, rippling across the carefully constructed facade of their lives. Then Ronald spoke again. Get out, he said coldly, looking at Michael. Leave this house. Now. Michael hesitated. Do you need me to help you pack? Ronald asked, and there was no mistaking the threat in his tone. Michael didn't respond. He simply turned and walked toward the front door, each step heavy with defeat. Madison lingered, looking lost, like a child who didn't know whether to stay or follow. "Go," Jessica said quietly, without anger. "Whatever story you're telling yourself about love or fate, it ends here." Madison swallowed hard and followed Michael without another word. The door closed behind them with a finality that felt almost sacred. Jessica sat down again. Around her, the remnants of dinner sat untouched. The wine had gone warm. The candles burned low. But she felt lighter than she had in months. And this was only the beginning. As the front door closed behind Madison and Michael, the house fell into a tense, suspended silence. Jessica sat perfectly still, her posture straight but relaxed, her eyes resting not on anyone in particular but on the centerpiece, a bouquet of white lilies that now seemed oddly funereal in the dim candlelight. She didn't speak right away. She let the silence linger. It was not just a pause, it was a statement. A deliberate contrast to the chaos that had just walked out of the room. Her parents sat frozen, each lost in their own whirlpool of thoughts. Ronald, still gripping the edge of the table, stared at the documents with narrowed eyes, reading and rereading as though searching for any line that might lessen the blow. Deborah, hands clasped tightly in her lap, kept her eyes on Jessica, as if silently pleading for an explanation that went deeper than facts and proof, something human, something emotional. But Jessica was not ready to go there. Not yet. She picked up her wine glass, swirled the deep red liquid once, then slowly stood. When she raised the glass again, her voice was calm, almost too calm, the measured tone of someone who had waited a very long time to speak. "I would like to finish my toast now," she said. Her parents turned to her, unsure how to respond, unsure whether it was appropriate. But Jessica didn't wait for permission. She raised her glass slightly higher. "To the truth," she said, her gaze unwavering. "To the truth that always finds a way out, no matter how many locks are placed on the door. To the justice that doesn't arrive with drama or vengeance, but with clarity. And to time, because it reveals everything, eventually." Ronald slowly reached for his own glass and lifted it in silent agreement. Deborah followed suit, her hand trembling as she raised hers. They drank in silence. Jessica took a single sip, then placed her glass back down and turned toward the sideboard again. This time, she pulled out a smaller envelope, plain, sealed, with her name handwritten on the front. She looked at it for a moment before turning and placing it in front of her mother. "I wrote this weeks ago," she said. "Before I knew how tonight would unfold. It's not evidence. It's not a confession. It's just something I needed you to read when you're ready. Alone." Deborah nodded, clutching the envelope to her chest as though it were fragile. Jessica then turned to her father. "Dad, I know this changes a lot. I know what you're probably thinking, that I should have come to you sooner. But I needed to do it this way. Not for spectacle. For control. Because for once, I needed to tell the story before someone else wrote the ending for me." Ronald nodded once, slowly. His expression was hard to read, pride, pain, perhaps a mix of both. Jessica resumed her seat again, and for a long time no one spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence, it was a heavy one, the kind that settles over a room after the fire has passed through, leaving only scorched ground and the certainty that nothing will be as it was before. The rest of the family began to murmur faintly, shifting in their seats, some excusing themselves to the kitchen, others wandering into the living room as if needing to breathe different air. Jessica remained where she was, calm and composed, her thoughts no longer focused on Madison or Michael, but on what came next. She had not simply exposed them to cause hurt. This wasn't about pain. It was about control, reclaiming hers. For too long, she had played the part of the peacemaker, the daughter who made things easy, the wife who tolerated distance and deflection. And now, that role was over. Later that night, as the guests slowly departed and her parents prepared to leave, Deborah lingered by the door. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke again. "You didn't cry," she said. "Not once." Jessica gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I did all my crying before tonight," she said. "I just didn't do it where anyone could see." Deborah nodded, understanding perhaps more than she could say. Then she kissed her daughter on the cheek and left without another word. When the house was finally quiet, Jessica sat alone in the dim living room, the fire in the hearth now a faint glow. The documents, now back in their folder, sat on the coffee table like a closed chapter. But she knew it wasn't truly over. She had removed herself from the lie, that was step one. But there were more layers still buried beneath the surface, things even her family didn't know yet. She walked to the bedroom and sat at the edge of the bed. The silence now was different. It wasn't the suffocating kind from earlier. It was clean. Empty. Ready to be filled with something new. Before sleeping, she opened her laptop and checked her email. A new message from her attorney was waiting. She opened it, read the updates on the divorce proceedings, and replied with a single line, "Proceed as planned." Then she clicked on a second message, one she had starred weeks ago, from a real estate agent in Seattle. It was about a condo near the water. She had liked the photos. The view. The promise of anonymity. She stared at the screen for a long time before finally closing it and lying back in bed. Outside, Boston was quiet. The city that had shaped her, that had given her both her identity and her pain, was beginning to fade in her mind. The toast had been made. The truth had landed. And now, the real unraveling was about to begin. Jessica had played the perfect wife, the loyal sister, the dutiful daughter for too long. But that woman had ended her performance tonight. And the new one, the one who would not be betrayed, who would not be silenced, had just taken the stage. The following morning arrived without fanfare. The sun filtered gently through the linen curtains, casting a pale warmth across the hardwood floor of Jessica's bedroom. She awoke not with the disorientation that often accompanies seismic emotional shifts, but with a striking clarity. There were no remnants of confusion, no lingering echoes of what had been said or done. She remembered every second of the previous night, not as a dream or a nightmare, but as something solid, carved permanently into her memory. She made herself a cup of strong black coffee and sat at the kitchen island, the silence around her no longer oppressive but deliberate, like the kind of silence that exists inside a courtroom just before the verdict. The folder containing the documents from the night before still sat on the dining table, precisely where she had left it. Neat. Ordered. Ready for the next phase. Around 9 o'clock, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw it was her cousin Elise, who had been present at the dinner. Jessica let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then came a message, "I don't even know what to say. I had no idea. Call me when you can." Jessica closed the message and opened another app, a secure cloud storage where the digital versions of the same documents were stored. She selected a subset of files and attached them to an email addressed to her lawyer. In the subject line, she wrote, "Additional evidence, please file with property claim." She didn't need to reread the content. She had studied every line of those bank statements, every pixel of the photographs, every detail in the text message transcripts. It was all organized meticulously, color-coded, labeled by date, with supplementary notes from the private investigator she had hired. It wasn't just evidence of infidelity. It was a blueprint of betrayal. And more than that, it was a paper trail that revealed a plan far more sinister than emotional treason. Jessica walked back to the table and finally reopened the leather folder. She removed one of the thinner manila envelopes from inside, the one containing the forged signatures. Weeks earlier, during a quiet Saturday morning, she had discovered the first of them while organizing their household financials. At first glance, they looked like ordinary documents, home maintenance approvals, tax filings, even joint account authorizations. But upon closer inspection, she noticed inconsistencies in the pen strokes, the alignment of her signature, the timing of when these papers had been filed. She hadn't signed them. But Michael had. Or rather, he had signed for her. The most disturbing part hadn't been the forgery itself, but what those documents had led to. One file in particular, a transfer of ownership clause tied to their home, had been discreetly embedded in a larger packet of routine maintenance approvals. Michael had effectively tried to shift ownership of the house to include his name without her consent. And what had once been her grandmother's legacy, a home passed down through the women of her family, had almost become a joint asset. One more step, and it would have been vulnerable to liquidation in the divorce. Jessica had discovered this just in time. She had printed those specific files and marked them with red tabs. Now she reviewed them once more, ensuring everything was intact. She had no doubt that Michael had expected her to be emotionally paralyzed by the revelation of his affair. He had counted on her silence, her humiliation. He had gambled on her not fighting back. And Madison, well, Madison had never looked past the immediate attention of the moment. She wouldn't have understood the gravity of forged documents or property clauses. She had probably believed she was winning something. Jessica placed the red-tabbed files into a separate envelope and labeled it, Legal, Priority Submission. That afternoon, she met her attorney, Cynthia Aldridge, in a private office near Beacon Hill. Cynthia was a seasoned divorce and property lawyer with a sharp mind and a deep understanding of quiet warfare, the kind that didn't unfold in shouting matches but in paper trails and clauses buried 3 pages deep in legalese. Cynthia reviewed the envelope's contents slowly, methodically. She didn't speak for the first 10 minutes, only nodded, flipped pages, and made notes in the margins. When she finally looked up, her expression was composed but tight. "Jessica," she said, "what you have here is more than enough to support your property claim. The forged signature on the transfer document alone could open Michael up to criminal charges if we pursue that route. Are you sure you want to go this far?" Jessica didn't hesitate. "I'm not doing this to punish him. I'm doing it to protect what's mine." Cynthia nodded. "Then we'll file everything first thing tomorrow. I'll also initiate a formal complaint regarding the forgery. That should be enough to ensure he's removed from any claim to the property before the divorce is finalized." Jessica leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. "He thought I'd be too ashamed to fight back. Let's make sure he understands just how wrong he was." Later that evening, back home, Jessica received a message from an unknown number. The text was short: "You had no right to humiliate me like that." She didn't need to ask who it was. She blocked the number immediately and deleted the message. She had expected Michael to retaliate. She had expected anger, blame, deflection. What she hadn't expected, but had hoped for, was that he'd begin to realize how little power he now held. As night fell, Jessica returned to the dining room table and began sorting the remaining documents. Not all of them were for the courts. Some were personal records, things she had uncovered that hinted at even deeper betrayals, emails between Michael and colleagues, unexplained payments to third-party accounts, overlapping hotel reservations in different cities. These weren't necessary for the divorce or property claim, but they were important. They were pieces of a puzzle she was still assembling. And somewhere in that puzzle was Madison's role. Not just as a willing participant in an affair, but as a co-conspirator in something larger. Jessica had found messages between them, hints of conversations about what to do when the house becomes theirs, suggestions of travel plans once things are settled. It wasn't just an affair. It was a plan. One that involved displacing her. And they had almost succeeded. But now, as Jessica locked the folder away in a safe, she felt something settle in her chest, not vengeance, but resolve. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but she had already done the hardest part. She had looked betrayal in the eye and refused to be shattered by it. The next steps would demand more strength, more strategy. But she had both. And she was just getting started. It was nearly midnight when Jessica sat in her grandmother's old armchair, the leather creaking beneath her as she shifted her weight and opened a thin notebook. It wasn't for documentation or evidence, not this time. This one was personal. A place to sketch thoughts too sharp to say aloud, memories too tangled for simple retelling. But instead of writing, she just stared at the first blank page, the pen idle in her hand. She had known for weeks, even months, that something wasn't right. But the deeper truth, the one that now pressed like weight on her chest, wasn't about the affair. It was the intent. The cold, calculated nature of it. Jessica wasn't naive. People made mistakes. People betrayed each other. But this had been deliberate. The night before, when she had handed out the documents during the dinner, she had chosen not to include everything. There had been more. Conversations she hadn't shared aloud, messages that revealed the affair was only one layer in a much more complicated web. The full story had started to form months earlier, on a rainy Thursday evening when she had stumbled upon the first financial discrepancy. A duplicate utility charge. At first, she thought it was a billing error. But when she followed the trail, she discovered a quiet pattern: withdrawals in unusual amounts from an account she didn't typically monitor, checks written out of sequence, the name of a contractor she'd never hired. Curiosity had driven her to dig deeper. She wasn't looking for betrayal then, just for clarity. But clarity gave way to suspicion when she noticed that many of the payments had one thing in common: they were all tied to a secondary property she didn't recognize. When she questioned Michael casually about the expense, he brushed it off, said it was work-related, something for a client that passed through their joint account by mistake. Jessica had let it slide. But her mind had already marked the inconsistency. A week later, she called the contact listed on the invoice and asked for confirmation. What she received in return was a confused voice explaining they had been hired for renovations, at a home located not in Boston, but in Providence. The address was unfamiliar to Jessica. She wrote it down, waited until the following Saturday, and drove out herself. It was a modest two-bedroom home on the corner of a quiet residential block. Nothing about it suggested infidelity or deception, at least, not from the outside. But as she sat in her car across the street, watching the front porch for signs of life, a woman exited the front door with a baby carrier in hand. Not Madison, someone else. Jessica didn't know what she had expected to find, but this wasn't it. She didn't approach. Didn't make a scene. She took photos from her seat, zoomed in on the mailbox, and noted the name listed on a small bronze plate near the doorbell. Michael's name. And Madison's. Both. Together. On the deed. It hadn't been just an affair. It had been a plan. The renovation expenses, the redirection of funds, the subtle shifting of finances, all designed to create a life apart from her, funded by her own resources. When Jessica confronted her private investigator about the property, the woman confirmed it had been acquired quietly 6 months earlier through a shell entity, one that had Jessica's forged signature on the co-authorization of funds. But even more damning than the paperwork was the digital trail. Messages between Madison and Michael revealed discussions not about whether they should be together, but how soon they could move Jessica out of the house in Boston. One message, dated 3 weeks before the anniversary dinner, said, "She's starting to ask questions. If we don't move on this soon, she'll get ahead of us." Another read, "Once she's out, we can list it and move everything into the trust. She'll walk away with nothing." Jessica closed the notebook, no longer interested in writing. The facts were etched clearly in her memory now. They hadn't just betrayed her emotionally. They had plotted to remove her entirely. Not just from the marriage, but from the very life she had built, her home, her stability, her name. It all made sense now. The calculated charm Michael had turned on in recent months. The sudden interest Madison had taken in her schedule, asking subtly invasive questions about when she would be home or away. They hadn't been reckless. They had been methodical, strategic, and utterly shameless. Jessica knew then why she had chosen to stay silent until the dinner. Not just for impact. Not for revenge. But because she needed the full picture first. She needed to be sure. And now, there was no doubt left. The next morning, she drove to her father's law office. Ronald hadn't practiced actively in recent years but still maintained his license and worked as a consultant. He met her in the private conference room, already looking like he knew what she was going to say. She laid out the documents, the real estate acquisition, the trust paperwork in process, the forged consents, and the investigator's full report. Ronald read every page with the same gravity he had once reserved for trial preparation. When he finished, he leaned back and removed his glasses. "They were planning to evict you," he said simply. Jessica nodded. "Legally, they wouldn't have been able to follow through, not without a fight," he added. "But that's the point, isn't it? They were counting on you not fighting. I think Madison honestly believed I'd walk away quietly. That I'd be too humiliated to say anything." Ronald narrowed his eyes. "She didn't just betray you. She tried to dismantle your life." "That's what they never understood," Jessica said. "My silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy." Ronald reached across the table and placed a hand on hers. "Then let's make sure you win this war." Jessica left the office that day with more than legal momentum. She left with her father's backing, not just as a parent, but as someone who understood the language of conflict. She had allies now. And while emotional support had its place, it was the legal preparation that would deliver the real victory. Back home, she called Cynthia and updated her on the new documentation. The lawyer's voice was sharper now, more energized. "We'll file an injunction against the property in Providence and freeze any further movement in the trust. We'll also include Madison as a named party in the suit. She's not getting away untouched." Jessica didn't smile, but there was a quiet satisfaction in her voice when she said, "Good." The mask had fallen. The charade was over. And with every step, Jessica was turning the tide not just on a broken marriage, but on an entire narrative that had been written without her consent. They had expected a woman broken by betrayal. But what they had created, unintentionally, foolishly, was a woman with nothing left to lose, and everything to reclaim. The morning after meeting with her father, Jessica woke with a strange sense of anticipation. Not anxiety, not dread, but readiness. There were no more shadows left to hide in, no more assumptions left to entertain about what Michael or Madison might do. Everything was now exposed. But while most of the immediate damage had been contained, the deeper consequence of their scheme was only beginning to unfold. Her lawyer had been swift in filing the injunction against the secondary property and trust fund movement. Within 24 hours, both Madison and Michael received formal legal notices informing them they were now parties to an active property dispute. Jessica didn't expect to hear from them directly, not anymore. The era of emotional games had ended. What remained was a legal battlefield, and she was fully armored. She spent most of that day preparing another set of documents, not for court, but for herself. A list of her assets, every joint account that had to be closed, every contract or utility service to be transferred back into her name alone. She drafted a meticulous inventory of her belongings, marking each one she would take with her, and which ones she'd leave behind out of disinterest or principle. But in the quiet of the afternoon, while reviewing the last of her records, she found herself returning to the thought of the toast, the one she had made during the family dinner. The way she had lifted her glass, calm and composed, offering words that had stunned more than the affair itself. It had struck everyone not just as unexpected, but hauntingly deliberate. And it was. Because that toast hadn't been about revenge. It had been about liberation. She thought back to the early days of her marriage. The hope. The way she used to watch Michael from across the kitchen, reading contracts or laughing with colleagues on the phone, never imagining there could be so many layers behind his ambition. He had always presented himself as stable, reliable, someone who followed through. Jessica had admired that. She had needed that. And then there was Madison. Her younger sister had always been a tangle of contradictions, bright but reckless, charming but irresponsible. Jessica had made excuses for her for years. She had covered up Madison's missed bills, helped her through breakups, even paid off one of her credit card debts in secret so their parents wouldn't find out. There had always been a protective instinct there, not born of superiority, but of responsibility. She had felt responsible for her sister's chaos. It was that sense of responsibility that had blinded her for so long. But the toast had shattered that illusion. She had rehearsed it in her mind for weeks. Not the words, but the tone. The calmness. She had imagined what it would feel like to take control without raising her voice. To weaponize grace instead of rage. And when the moment came, it had felt almost surgical, a precise incision through the heart of a lie that had been swelling inside her home for more than a year. In truth, Jessica hadn't planned to present the documents at the dinner. That had been an improvised decision, sparked by Madison's arrogance and Michael's silence. But the toast, that had always been part of her plan. She needed them to understand that she wasn't the victim in their story. She was the narrator. And with that single gesture, she had reclaimed her role. By evening, she received a call from Cynthia. They responded, the attorney said. Michael's lawyer is claiming the property acquisition in Providence was a private investment made without Jessica's awareness but not using joint funds. Jessica nearly laughed. We both know that's not true. Cynthia agreed. We're submitting your bank records and the signed contractor agreements with your forged signature as evidence. That claim will fall apart quickly. But there's something else. Jessica stiffened. What? They're requesting mediation. The silence that followed was sharp. Jessica processed the implication. Mediation meant negotiation. It meant they were already preparing to make concessions. But it also meant they were trying to avoid going to court, where everything would become public. They're afraid of exposure, Jessica said. Yes. And frankly, they should be. If this hits trial, we have enough to prove intent to defraud, both in the financial and real estate actions. Jessica considered her response carefully. I'll agree to mediation. But only under strict conditions. No face-to-face meetings. No emotional appeals. Only facts. I'll draft the terms. As she ended the call, Jessica realized that something had shifted. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was initiating. Controlling. Dictating terms. And that was the purpose of the toast, not to hurt anyone, but to break the pattern that had defined her for too long. She no longer needed the approval of her family, the loyalty of a sister who never deserved it, or the comfort of a husband who had weaponized her trust. What she needed now was clarity. And autonomy. Later that night, she revisited the old family photo albums. There was a particular picture she hadn't seen in years, a candid taken at her wedding, where Madison stood behind her with a forced smile and Michael held Jessica's waist just a little too tightly. At the time, she had interpreted it as love. Looking at it now, it felt more like possession. She closed the album and placed it in the donation box. A few hours later, her phone buzzed with an alert. A private message on social media. The name surprised her, Lily Beckman, a former college friend she hadn't spoken to in years. Jessica opened it cautiously. I know it's been a long time, and maybe it's not my place, but I saw your sister with Michael 6 months ago. They were in New York, holding hands at a restaurant near my office. I didn't want to say anything then. I figured it wasn't my business. But after hearing what happened, I'm so sorry. Jessica stared at the message, her pulse steady. It didn't hurt. It didn't even sting. It simply confirmed something she already knew: the web had been far wider than she imagined, and it had reached back further than she had allowed herself to admit. She replied with a short, sincere thank you, then closed the app and locked her phone. The lies were no longer revelations. They were merely footprints leading away from a version of her life she had already begun to leave behind. And the woman who had once held her breath at every sign of betrayal was now breathing freely. She poured herself a glass of wine, stood by the window, and whispered a toast, not for others this time, but for herself. To peace. To truth. To the power of knowing exactly who you are when the silence finally answers back. 2 days after agreeing to mediation, Jessica received a call from her mother. The tone was delicate, almost cautious, like someone carefully stepping across thin ice. Deborah hadn't spoken much since the dinner, not out of disapproval, but likely out of shock. She was the kind of woman who clung to stability, to the idea that family meant unity, and Jessica's revelation had torn through that illusion like a blade. "Your father and I would like to talk," Deborah said softly. "Face to face. No pressure. Just, we need to understand." Jessica didn't ask what they needed to understand. She already knew. They wanted to make sense of how the fabric of their family had unraveled so violently. And more importantly, they wanted to know how their daughters, so close in childhood, had ended up on opposite ends of something so ruthless. She agreed to meet them that evening at their home in Newton. The air was thick with unease when she arrived. The spring light filtered through the large windows of the living room, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Deborah had made tea, of course, a habitual gesture, as if the familiarity of warm cups might soften the edges of the conversation to come. Ronald was already seated, his expression serious but not hostile. Jessica took her usual seat on the couch, placing her bag beside her, spine straight, prepared. "We've read everything," Ronald began. "What you gave us. And we've spoken to our lawyer. What Michael did, what Madison was part of, it's not just personal betrayal. It's theft. Intentional. Calculated." Jessica nodded. "That's what I've been trying to say. It wasn't about an affair. It was about erasing me from my own life." Deborah flinched at that. "She's still your sister?" "No," Jessica replied without hesitation. "She used to be. She made a different choice." Ronald leaned forward. "Jess, we're not here to defend them. What we saw the other night changed how we see both of them. We just need to understand why you didn't tell us sooner." Jessica hesitated for the first time. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the truth wasn't simple. "Because I knew no one would believe me at first." "Not really. Not fully. Because she's Madison, she's reckless, but she's charming. She's always been protected. And Michael, he wore the mask too well." Her mother looked down at her hands. "Do you really think we wouldn't have listened?" "I think you would have wanted to," Jessica said gently. "But you also would have tried to fix it. To keep the family together. You would have asked me to forgive her before I was ready." Deborah didn't deny it. "I needed to do it my way," Jessica added. "And I needed you to see it with your own eyes." Silence hung between them again, but this time, it was contemplative. Not defensive. Then Ronald said, "Your sister came to the house yesterday." Jessica didn't react. "And? She's not doing well," Deborah said. "She's scared. Angry. She said you've ruined her life." Jessica let out a breath, not a laugh, not quite. Just a quiet release of disbelief. "I didn't ruin her life. She built her future on my downfall. And when that didn't work, she called it unfair. She said Michael has stopped answering her calls," Deborah added, eyes flicking upward. "He's blaming her for the exposure." "He should," Jessica said. She handed him a loaded weapon in public and didn't expect it to backfire. Ronald raised a hand, calming the rising tension. "We're not asking you to forgive. We just needed you to know where things stand. That everything is broken. Not just between you three, but in this family." Jessica nodded. "It needed to break." Her mother's eyes brimmed slightly. "You've changed, Jess." "I had to," she answered. "Because I was disappearing." They didn't speak for a while after that. Just sat in the stillness, listening to the wind stir the trees outside. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't healing. But it was the beginning of something else, maybe recognition. Maybe understanding. When Jessica finally stood to leave, Deborah walked her to the door. As they reached the entryway, her mother paused and said, "I don't know how to be proud and heartbroken at the same time. But that's what I feel." Jessica looked at her with gentleness but without softness. "You don't have to choose." That night, back at home, Jessica received another message, this time from her cousin Elise again. She had been quiet since the dinner, but now she had something urgent to say. "You need to know something," the message read. "There's a rumor going around the family that you planned all of this, that the dinner was a setup, that you only waited to embarrass them publicly. Madison's been saying it to everyone who'll listen." Jessica closed her eyes. It didn't surprise her. Madison had always been skilled at rewriting reality to suit her needs. And now, without Michael shielding her, she was clawing at whatever sympathy she could find. But the damage was already done, not by Jessica, but by their actions. The documents were real. The betrayals were recorded. The fallout wasn't about theatrics. It was about consequences. Still, the rumor annoyed her. The next morning, she composed a short email and sent it to the extended family. No emotion. No dramatics. Just clarity. "I am aware of the narrative being spread regarding the family dinner and the events that followed. I feel no need to defend myself to those who were present and saw the evidence with their own eyes. I only ask that if anyone has questions, they come to me directly instead of indulging gossip. I have nothing to hide." Can Madison say the same? The responses were mixed. A few cousins replied with brief messages of support. One aunt sent a cold reply, "We all make mistakes. Some of us forgive." Jessica ignored it. Forgiveness wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a currency to be traded for silence. Later that week, she received confirmation from Cynthia that the mediation terms had been accepted. A neutral third-party mediator was scheduled to facilitate the process. Jessica would not have to face Michael or Madison directly. Everything would go through legal representatives and documented exchanges. It was exactly the structure she had wanted. But what surprised her was who reached out next. Her brother-in-law, Madison's ex-boyfriend, Evan, sent her a message. They hadn't spoken in over a year, not since his quiet exit from the family after his breakup with Madison. "I heard what happened," he wrote. "I always knew something wasn't right with them. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. For whatever that's worth." Jessica stared at the message for a long time. Then she replied with a single line. "Sometimes, the ones who walk away early see the clearest." The cracks in her family were no longer hidden. They were exposed, raw, undeniable. But they were also necessary. Because only through fracture had the truth been able to rise, and in that truth, Jessica had found something rare. Not vengeance. Not peace. But clarity. And that would be enough to carry her through the rest. The day of the mediation arrived with a heavy, overcast sky, casting muted light over Boston as if the city itself were holding its breath. Jessica sat in the private meeting room of Cynthia's office, the blinds drawn, her hands folded neatly on the smooth surface of the conference table. Beside her, Cynthia reviewed a fresh batch of documents. Across the hall, in a separate room, Michael and his legal team had gathered. Though they were in the same building, they would not see each other. That boundary had been non-negotiable. Jessica didn't need to hear Michael's voice. She didn't need to watch him pretend confusion or regret. She had seen enough of his performance over the years, the well-rehearsed charm, the lawyer's ease with language, the ability to twist even the most concrete of facts into fog. Today, the words would be handled by others. The facts, however, remained untouched. Mediation began with formality. A court-appointed neutral mediator reviewed the agenda and the terms both parties had agreed upon. On Jessica's side, there was no ambiguity. She was seeking dissolution of the marriage with zero claim from Michael to her inherited property, a complete relinquishment of joint financial assets that he had diverted, an acknowledgement of the forgery related to the Providence House, She wasn't asking for retribution, only restitution. Cynthia presented her evidence in waves, each packet carefully ordered, every accusation supported by documentation. The financial discrepancies, the photos of Michael at the second property, the messages with Madison, and, finally, the audio. That was Jessica's last card. Weeks earlier, before the dinner, the private investigator had caught Michael speaking on a call outside his office building. He hadn't noticed the recording device clipped to a parked courier's bike nearby. His voice was clear, his words damning. "She's passive. That's the thing about Jessica. She'll let it go. She always does. By the time she figures out what we've done, the house will already be in the trust, and Madison and I will be out of state. She won't fight, she'll disappear." Jessica hadn't shared this clip with anyone at the dinner. Not with her family. Not even with her lawyer until after the first hearing notice. She had saved it for this moment, when every lie would be stripped away with undeniable evidence. When the mediator heard the audio, her tone changed. The impartiality remained, but the energy shifted. What had begun as a formal negotiation became something much heavier. It was no longer about asset division. It was about uncovering intent. Michael's legal team requested a break. In the adjacent room, he reportedly had an outburst, not loud enough to be heard clearly, but enough that the receptionist at the front desk made a note of it in the appointment log. Shouting. Something about betrayal and setup. Jessica didn't flinch when Cynthia relayed it. "This is the first time," Jessica said, "that he's been forced to watch everything collapse while someone else narrates." Hours passed. Offers were exchanged. Proposals rejected. But with every piece of evidence Jessica's team delivered, Michael lost ground. By late afternoon, his lawyers had accepted her terms. He would forfeit all rights to the marital property, including the Boston house and any investments tied to Jessica's inheritance. He would not contest the divorce. He would drop all counterclaims regarding financial mismanagement, as those had been quietly added earlier, likely a last-ditch attempt to stall her momentum. But what truly marked the collapse wasn't legal. It was personal. That evening, after the session ended, Jessica returned home to find a manila envelope waiting on her doorstep. No return address. Inside was a handwritten letter, unmistakably Michael's handwriting. The tone was erratic, as if written in one sitting, without edits. A strange combination of anger, remorse, and self-pity. He blamed Madison. Then excused Madison. Claimed he had never truly loved her, said he only fell into the mess because Jessica had become distant. Then contradicted himself by calling Jessica manipulative, cold, and vindictive. Near the end of the letter came the most telling line, "You win. You always do. But I hope you're happy being alone." Jessica folded the letter in half and placed it in the kitchen drawer, where she stored warranties and expired coupons. It had no value. It was just noise. But Michael wasn't finished unraveling. 3 days later, a report surfaced from a mutual friend, someone who worked at the firm where Michael had been a senior partner. The internal audit team had begun reviewing his recent transactions. The red flags Jessica had uncovered in their joint accounts had mirrored patterns in his corporate spending. By the end of the week, Michael was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Jessica hadn't expected it. She hadn't gone after his job, hadn't sent the documents beyond what was legally required. But the house of cards he built hadn't just involved her. It had spread wider than she realized. And once it began to fall, no corner of his life remained untouched. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one was from the firm's ethics committee, requesting a deposition from Jessica regarding Michael's use of funds during their marriage, specifically regarding expenses billed to clients that might have overlapped with his personal activities. She answered their questions with precision. Dates. Documents. Receipts. She wasn't angry. She was just exact. Meanwhile, Madison had gone silent. Her social media accounts were deactivated. Her friends, those who had once gossiped alongside her, were distancing themselves. Even Deborah, hesitant as she was, had stopped defending her younger daughter. The last time Jessica saw her mother, she mentioned Madison was staying at a friend's place, alone and withdrawn. "She asked me to tell you she's sorry," Deborah had said. "But I told her that's not mine to deliver." Jessica appreciated that more than she let on. And then came the final fracture. Ronald called one afternoon and asked to meet. In his study, surrounded by old law books and faded family photos, he slid across the table a notarized amendment to his will. Jessica read it without reaction. "After what I've seen," Ronald said, "I can't leave this family's legacy in her hands. You were always the one who protected it, even from us." Jessica nodded. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. It wasn't a victory. It was balance restored. Michael's downfall hadn't been theatrical. It hadn't needed to be. It was precise, cumulative, and complete, a result of his own design. Jessica hadn't forced it. She had simply refused to stop it. And now, standing among the ruins of what had once been her life, she wasn't broken. She was free. Jessica had always known that betrayal rarely lived in isolation. It was never just two people behind closed doors whispering secrets in the dark. It was a network, a fragile yet persistent chain of omissions, half-truths, and deliberate blindness. Once she pulled the first thread, Michael's financial trail and Madison's quiet manipulations, the rest began to unravel. But what she discovered next widened the circle of betrayal far beyond what she had prepared for. It began with a call from Cynthia's assistant late one morning. "We found something," the woman said, her tone clipped and professional, but edged with unease. "It came through during the forensic review of your joint business expenses. There's a pattern we think you should see in person." Jessica drove to the office immediately, her stomach tight, but her mind calm. She had learned by now that panic was a waste of energy. At this point, nothing could surprise her, or so she believed. When she arrived, Cynthia greeted her with a printout in hand. It was a spreadsheet, color-coded, and annotated with brief notes. At first glance, it appeared similar to the others Jessica had reviewed: transactions, dates, line items. But as she read further, she noticed names. Familiar ones. One in particular stood out. A family friend. Naomi Adler. Jessica's breath caught, but she said nothing. Naomi had been close to the Millers for years, someone Jessica had once described as an aunt without the title. She had attended holidays, brought casseroles to every gathering, and was there when Jessica and Michael got engaged. Naomi had even spoken at their wedding, sharing a memory of Jessica's childhood that no one remembered giving her. Cynthia watched her carefully. There are 5 hotel transactions linked to Michael's secondary card. All under Naomi's name. Same city. Similar timing to his trips with Madison. Jessica sat down. "There's more," Cynthia continued. "We checked the timestamps on his company phone records. He had regular contact with Naomi during that period. More than with some of his colleagues." Jessica stared at the paper. Her mind reached for denial, for some angle that made this anything but what it seemed. But the patterns were clear. The financial links. The communication records. The overlapping presence. "He was seeing her too," Jessica said, the words slow and controlled. "We believe so," Cynthia confirmed. "And from what the PI has told us, there may be others." Over the next few days, the details came in piece by piece. A former intern at Michael's firm, a client he had worked with on a property case in Manhattan, a real estate broker Jessica had briefly met at a company function, all connected to him in subtle, but traceable ways. Jessica didn't know how many of them had crossed emotional lines or physical ones, but the sheer scale of the deception was staggering. It wasn't about love. Not even about lust. It was a pattern of manipulation, of using charm and power as currency to acquire influence, comfort, distraction. Jessica didn't cry. She didn't rage. But she did feel something raw and unexpected, clarity. Not the kind that cuts through emotion, but the kind that rearranges it. This had never been about her not being enough. It had been about him needing to feel like more. More powerful. More desirable. More in control. Back at home, she sat in her study and pulled out an old photo album. One of the early ones. It held a picture of her, Michael, and Naomi at a vineyard in the Berkshires. She stared at it for a long time. Jessica had been wearing a soft green scarf, laughing with a glass of wine in hand. Naomi stood beside her, a hand lightly resting on Michael's shoulder. At the time, it had seemed friendly. Protective. Now it looked like possession. Later that evening, she received a message from her cousin Elise again. This time, it wasn't a warning or a sympathy note. "You might want to talk to Veronica," the message read. "She said something odd last week. About knowing more than she should about Madison and Michael." Veronica was a longtime friend of Madison's, not particularly close to Jessica, but always present in the periphery. Jessica reached out. To her surprise, Veronica agreed to meet. They met at a small cafe in Cambridge. Veronica looked nervous. She stirred her coffee for a full minute before saying anything. "I should have said something earlier," she began. "But I was scared. I didn't want to get dragged into it." "Dragged into what?" Jessica asked, keeping her voice calm. "I overheard them. Last year, at Madison's place. I dropped by unannounced, and they were in the middle of an argument. It wasn't about the affair, at least not directly. They were fighting over how to handle you." Jessica's pulse quickened. "He said you were suspicious. That he needed more time." Madison was angry. She said she was tired of waiting. She wanted a public relationship. And he told her it would only happen once the property was handled. His exact words. "I didn't understand what that meant then. But I do now." Jessica exhaled slowly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because Madison threatened me. She said if I ever repeated what I heard, she'd ruin me. She knew about something I did years ago, something stupid, and she said she'd expose it." Jessica leaned back, studying Veronica carefully. There was fear in her eyes, but also relief. Like someone releasing a secret that had been eating them alive. "I'm not here to punish you," Jessica said. "But thank you for telling me." That night, Jessica compiled everything, the financial reports, the names, the testimonies, the timeline. It wasn't for court. It wasn't for vengeance. It was for herself. To close the chapter properly. To leave no room for doubt. She placed the files in a labeled binder, then slid it into a locked cabinet. She would never look at it again unless absolutely necessary. But it was there. Proof that what had happened wasn't a singular betrayal. It was a culture of deceit that had wormed its way through every corner of her life, a web that spanned not just her home, but her history. And now, the web had been cleared. She stood by the window that night and looked out over the city. The air was cool. The streets quiet. Michael's downfall hadn't ended with him losing Jessica. It had ended with the truth revealing how little of him there had ever been to begin with. And Jessica, standing alone but unshaken, had never felt more whole. The apartment had grown quieter over the past few days, as if the walls themselves understood the slow decrescendo of conflict that had filled them for months. Jessica moved through the rooms deliberately, her motions unhurried. It was no longer about cleaning up after destruction, but about choosing what deserved to stay. Her grandmother's clock, the one that chimed softly every hour, remained. The books she had kept for years, annotated in the margins, were stacked neatly in boxes labeled for storage. Other things, framed photos, decorative gifts from her wedding, keepsakes with stories too heavy to carry, had been packed away for donation. On the kitchen table, next to a nearly empty cup of coffee, lay 2 plane tickets. one to Seattle, dated in 2 weeks. The other, unused, from last fall, a trip she and Michael had planned and never taken. She hadn't thrown it away. Not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of what had been delayed. What had been stolen. The decision to leave Boston had come quietly. Not in a moment of anger or escape, but during a walk along the Charles River, when she realized she no longer looked at the city with love. Every street corner, every familiar shop window, now bore a shadow. There were too many ghosts here, not just of betrayal, but of who she used to be, a woman who smiled through uncertainty, who adapted instead of resisting, who mistook silence for strength. Seattle had never been part of her original plan. But weeks earlier, during a conversation with an old college friend who worked for an environmental nonprofit, Jessica had heard something that sparked interest, a new initiative focused on urban rewilding, combining environmental advocacy with community development. The organization needed a project manager with legal knowledge and logistical experience. Jessica had both. She sent her application the next day. 3 interviews later, she received the offer. Accepting it wasn't difficult. Informing her family, however, was another matter. She invited her parents over one final time before the move. They arrived just after noon, Ronald carrying a small box of garden herbs Jessica had once grown on the back porch, Deborah with a tin of her famous lemon cookies, the ones Jessica had loved as a child but hadn't tasted in years. They sat in the living room, their bodies poised with expectation. "I'm leaving Boston," Jessica said plainly. "In 2 weeks." Her mother's shoulders sagged. "For how long?" "Indefinitely. I've taken a position in Seattle. A full-time project with room to grow." Ronald said nothing at first. He simply nodded once, a slow and measured gesture. "You're sure?" Deborah asked, her voice soft, as though part of her hoped there was still a chance to change the outcome. Jessica nodded. "Yes. I need space. Not just from what happened, but from who I was here. Everything in this place reminds me of it." "We'll miss you," Deborah said. "It won't feel the same without you." Jessica smiled faintly. "It's not supposed to." The conversation turned practical, logistics, timelines, plans to ship her belongings. Ronald asked for the new address. Deborah offered to fly out for the holidays, which Jessica accepted with polite ambiguity. She appreciated the offer but knew she might need the time alone more than she could say out loud. Later that evening, she received a text from Elise. "Madison found out about the move. She's furious. Says you're abandoning the family." Jessica stared at the screen and felt nothing. Not irritation. Not grief. Just a quiet confirmation that her decision was right. That night, she sat alone in her bedroom, reviewing her resignation letter to the local charity board she had volunteered with for years. It was heartfelt, but brief. Gratitude without detail. Her departure needed no drama. As the days passed, her apartment emptied. Movers came. Boxes disappeared. The only room she kept intact until the last moment was her study. On the final night, she sat at the desk and wrote letters, not to people, but to versions of herself she was ready to leave behind. To the woman who once tolerated being silenced, "You didn't deserve that, but you survived it." To the woman who believed love was proven by endurance, "You were wrong, but you were brave." To the woman who stayed loyal long after loyalty became self-destruction, "You are forgiven." She folded each letter and placed them into a sealed envelope, which she labeled with the word, "Closure." It wasn't for anyone else. She packed it into her suitcase with her passport and a worn paperback she hadn't yet finished. The morning of the flight, the city was quiet under gray skies. Jessica stood at the gate, one carry-on by her side, a scarf looped around her neck. She didn't look back. Not once. On the plane, she took a window seat. As the aircraft climbed, Boston shrank beneath her, a web of memories reduced to lines and grids. For the first time in months, her lungs expanded fully. She didn't cry. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt clean. When she landed in Seattle, the sky was crisp and pale blue. The nonprofit's driver waited with a cardboard sign that read, J. Miller. He was a young man, cheerful and efficient. As he loaded her bags into the car, he asked if this was her first time in the city. "First time living here," she replied. "Not the first time starting over." They drove in silence for a while, passing tall evergreens and sharp hills. The city's energy was different, still bustling, but not familiar. And that, to Jessica, was its greatest gift. Her new apartment was small but full of light. It overlooked the bay, with just enough of a view to remind her that movement was always possible. That water never stayed still. That evening, she unpacked only what she needed: a few clothes, a journal, a photo of her grandmother, and a closure envelope. She placed it in the drawer beside her bed and left the rest for the next day. She went out onto the balcony and watched the horizon darken. Below, the city murmured with a rhythm she hadn't yet learned. But she would. On her terms. With no one standing behind her to rewrite her story. This was not escape. It was return. Not to a place, but to herself. The first week in Seattle passed like a breath Jessica hadn't known she'd been holding. The apartment, though compact, suited her perfectly. It was modern but warm, with wood paneling and large windows that let in generous light. She found herself waking earlier than usual, not from anxiety but from a renewed rhythm. Her body, once taut with tension, moved freely through the open space. Each morning, she made coffee, stood barefoot on the small balcony, and let the chill air settle into her skin. It felt like shedding. She began her new role at the environmental nonprofit with quiet focus. The office was filled with people who were passionate, blunt, and unpretentious, a stark contrast to the sharp edges of the legal circles she'd once navigated. No one here knew her as the woman whose husband slept with her sister, or the woman who exposed everything at a dinner table. Here, she was just Jessica. And for now, that was more than enough. But one Thursday evening, as she sat on the floor surrounded by project files, her phone rang with an out-of-state number. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something in her gut nudged her to answer. "Jessica Miller?" the voice on the line asked. "Yes, speaking. This is Sandra Calloway. I'm your father's attorney." Jessica's breath paused. Sandra was not the family's usual legal contact. Ronald typically handled everything himself or through his firm. "I'm calling to inform you that your father updated his estate documents last week. As part of the changes, he requested I reach out to you directly with a summary." Jessica sat up straighter. "Is he all right?" "He's fine. This isn't related to health. It's, well, a decision. A significant one. Go on." Sandra explained, with a measured tone, that Ronald had amended his will to reflect recent events. Madison and Michael had been removed entirely as beneficiaries. Instead, Ronald had divided his assets between Jessica and a women's shelter organization that Jessica had supported quietly for years, an initiative she had introduced to her parents months before the scandal broke. Jessica didn't speak for several seconds. "He removed Madison?" "Yes. Completely. He filed the amendment through our office with a notarized statement explaining his decision. I'm legally permitted to share the summary now, but you'll receive full documentation by courier." "Does Madison know?" "We're not obligated to inform her unless the will is executed due to death, but based on family conversations, yes, she's aware." Jessica thanked her and ended the call. The line went dead, but her thoughts surged. This wasn't justice. That had already been delivered, in the form of legal filings and Michael's public collapse. This was something else. A symbol. Her father, a man of conservative values and measured actions, had drawn a line where she never expected him to. And it wasn't out of spite, she knew Ronald too well for that. It was grief turned into clarity. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Elise. "You'll want to know. Madison's been calling everyone. She found out about the will. Says Dad chose sides. She's spiraling." Jessica replied only, "She made the choice." He made a response. 2 days later, the documents arrived. A thick envelope, sealed in a crisp blue folder. Inside were official copies, including Ronald's handwritten statement attached as an appendix. Asterisk, "I built this life for my children," he had written. "But inheritance is not a right. It is a trust. And trust, once broken, must be earned again, or lost." Jessica did not ask for justice. She acted with it. "This decision is final." Jessica reread the page several times. Not for validation, but for the weight of it. Her father had seen her. Had watched everything fall apart and still named her worthy of what remained. That same night, she received a call from an unknown number. She let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message. It was Madison. Her voice was wrecked. Unsteady. "You think you've won," she said. "But you didn't. You destroyed everything. You think he gave it to you because you're better than me? You're not. You're just colder. He'll regret this. One day, they all will." Jessica deleted the message. She didn't hate her sister. That emotion had dissolved months ago. What remained was detachment, the necessary kind that allowed healing. She had offered the family her truth. Some had received it. Others had recoiled. But Jessica wasn't responsible for what they did with the truth after it arrived. The following week, she visited the shelter Ronald had listed in the will. She met with the director, a woman named Clarice, and asked for a tour. The facility was modest but full of life, women cooking together in the shared kitchen, children playing in a corner room with donated toys. Jessica introduced herself not as a donor, but as a listener. "I came because I want to do more," she said. "Not for charity. For continuity." Clarice nodded with a knowing smile. Continuity starts when pain turns into plans. Jessica offered her time, her resources, and eventually, her legal knowledge to help residents navigate housing contracts, custody issues, and employment rights. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. One evening, while helping a woman file for a restraining order, Jessica paused and looked at the stack of forms in her hand. There, amid the ink and signatures, was a life being rebuilt. She didn't think of Michael. She didn't think of Madison. She thought only of the quiet revolution that begins when someone believes they're allowed to take back what was stolen from them. By spring, Seattle no longer felt new. It felt natural. The city hadn't healed her. She had done that herself. And now, with each day, she was no longer just surviving her past. She was designing her future. Jessica stood on the rooftop garden of her apartment complex, overlooking the shimmering waters of Elliott Bay. The air was thick with salt and pine and the low murmur of city sounds humming in the distance. In one hand, she held a notebook, in the other, a pen capped with fingerprints. It had become her evening ritual, stepping away from screens, responsibilities, and the ever-present weight of survival, to simply write. The pages of her notebook weren't filled with narrative or analysis. They held fragments. Thoughts. Pieces of herself she hadn't known needed saving until she saw them written in her own handwriting. On one page, she had written a line that returned to her now like a prayer: "The silence I once feared has become my sanctuary." It had been over 3 months since she arrived in Seattle, and though she was not yet healed in the romantic sense of the word, she was whole. She had built new habits, made new acquaintances, and even begun attending a small writing group on Sundays, a quiet collection of women and men who shared fiction and poetry in a dusty bookstore basement surrounded by second-hand novels. It was during one of these meetings that she met Olivia, a literature professor in her late 40s with silver-streaked hair and a penchant for uncomfortable truths. Olivia had noticed Jessica's guarded approach to storytelling early on. "You write around a wound," she said one night after Jessica read aloud a short story about a woman who couldn't remember her name after a betrayal. "But you never write through it." Jessica had blinked at her, the remark both irritating and precise. She hadn't replied then, but she had taken it home. Thought about it. And for the first time, stopped trying to protect the characters in her stories from pain. She allowed them to break. To remember. To bleed honestly. The results were immediate and painful and beautiful. Outside the writing group, her life was still simple, but no longer small. She had grown close to a few of her colleagues at the nonprofit. Not in a way that mirrored old friendships from Boston, but in a way that felt sustainable. There was Jonah, a field coordinator with a loud laugh and a stubborn sense of justice, and Priya, a policy specialist who had survived her own quiet devastation years earlier and carried the calm wisdom of someone who knew exactly how fragile healing could be. Jessica didn't tell them the full story of what had happened in Boston. Not at first. But they knew enough. That she had left behind a complicated divorce. That there had been betrayal. That her family was fractured. No one asked for more than she offered. And that, more than anything, made her stay. She found comfort in the routine, not the rigid kind that once dulled her days in Boston, but one built with intention. Each week, she walked through Discovery Park with her journal, answering emails only afternoon. She kept a small herb garden on her windowsill. She bought books without checking reviews. She allowed herself silence. Allowed herself boredom. Allowed herself peace. One morning, while sipping coffee and responding to an inquiry about her next community workshop, she received a short email from Elise. "Thought you should know, Michael left town. No one's seen him since the audit went public. And Madison, she's moved in with an old college friend. She's working part-time. Hasn't spoken to anyone in weeks." Jessica stared at the screen. There was no weight in the message. No spark of satisfaction. It was just information. Static. Like hearing about a storm that had already passed through someone else's city. She closed the email and returned to her notes. That weekend, she was invited to speak at a local event honoring women working in social advocacy. It was a small gathering, no more than 40 people, held in a community center filled with mismatched chairs and handmade banners. Jessica didn't plan to speak at length. But when she stood at the front of the room and looked out at the faces before her, something unlocked. "I didn't come here to escape," she said. "I came here because I needed to remember who I was before everything else told me who to be." We don't talk enough about what it means to reclaim your own voice after it's been used against you. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop justifying your pain and start building from it. There was silence. Then nods. Then applause. Later that night, she received an email from Clarice at the shelter. "One of our residents attended your talk. She said you made her believe there's life after silence. I just thought you'd want to know." Jessica replied with a simple thank you. Then closed her laptop and went for a walk. The city at night felt safe now. Not familiar yet, but known. Like a language she was slowly becoming fluent in. On her way back, she passed a street musician playing a soft, melancholy version of an old jazz standard. She stopped to listen. Dropped a $5 bill into the open case. Smiled. The scars she carried no longer dictated the tempo of her days. They were just reminders, bookmarks in a story that had nearly been written without her consent. But now, every page was hers. And she had only just begun the next chapter. The spring months unfolded with a kind of deliberate stillness in Jessica's life, not devoid of activity, but full of balance. Each morning brought her the sound of gulls circling above the bay, the faint clang of boat masts echoing through the harbor, and the low hum of a city rising into its own rhythm. She had never known a routine so quiet that it felt almost sacred. She hadn't just left Boston. She had stepped into a life she had never dared imagine, one built entirely by her own hands. Her days at the nonprofit had grown fuller as her role expanded. She was now the lead on a new urban sustainability initiative, integrating community housing with green infrastructure. It was technical work, layered and complex, but deeply meaningful. In each meeting, each strategy session, Jessica saw the tangible results of decisions not made out of obligation, but out of purpose. Every blueprint was a new beginning for someone, and by extension, for herself. But her deepest transformation came not from the work, but from the silence that followed the noise. In those quiet hours at night, curled beneath a blanket on the small love seat in her living room, Jessica began writing her story. Not in pieces, not in fragments, but in full. She didn't start with the betrayal or the revelations. She started with the way it felt to lose a version of yourself you thought was unshakable. She wrote of loyalty misinterpreted as weakness, of the danger of overlooking small lies, and the ache of realizing that sometimes, family wounds cut the deepest not because of cruelty, but because of expectation. The writing became ritual. Page after page, night after night, she poured her voice into the manuscript. And when she was done, she submitted it, anonymously at first, to a small, independent publisher in Portland. 3 weeks later, they called. The editor had read it in one sitting. She didn't ask for revisions. She didn't ask for explanation. She asked when Jessica could come in to sign the contract. They released the book under a title Jessica had written on a scrap of paper one night after a long walk, the day I toasted my freedom. She chose not to use her full name, just J. Miller, not out of fear, but to let the story speak for itself. It wasn't about celebrity. It was about connection. The book began modestly. A few hundred copies. Then a few thousand. Then it began to ripple outward, shared in book clubs, online forums, community groups. Women began writing letters. Not just readers, survivors. People who had been silenced, ignored, rewritten. Their messages arrived in her inbox every morning like offerings of solidarity. Your story felt like my life. I never told anyone what happened to me until I read your words. Thank you for showing us it's not weakness to walk away. It's power. Jessica didn't reply to every message. But she read each one. Sometimes twice. Back in Boston, the book found its way into reluctant hands. Elise messaged her after reading it. Everyone knows it's you, she wrote. Madison is denying everything. Michael, no one talks about him anymore. His name is a shadow. Jessica didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. One rainy afternoon, a reporter from a national publication requested an interview. Jessica declined. She wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. She had never written her story to make headlines. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a record. Still, the book continued to spread. And in the quiet corners of her apartment, Jessica began to write again, not about pain, but about growth. Not about betrayal, but about rebuilding. Her next manuscript explored the subtleties of reinvention, not through grand gestures, but through the mundane, planting basil on a windowsill, choosing silence over confrontation, reading a book with the window open. One evening, as the sun sank behind the city skyline, casting orange across the water, she poured herself a glass of red wine and stepped out onto the balcony. There was no celebration. No audience. Just the sound of wind and her own breath. She raised her glass. Not to victory. Not to revenge. But to truth. To dignity. To the long, patient process of becoming whole. She thought of her grandmother then. Of the house she had once fought to protect, and the legacy that had nearly been stripped from her. She thought of her father, who had believed in justice when others looked away. She thought of Madison, not with hate, not even with sadness, but with distance. A figure from a former life, now blurred at the edges of memory. And finally, she thought of the version of herself who once believed that silence was strength, that sacrifice was the price of love, and that endurance meant success. That woman no longer lived here. Jessica had rebuilt not just her life, but her voice. And she had used it, with precision, with softness, with force, to remind herself and the world that freedom, once earned, is not a loud parade. It is a quiet, deliberate choice made every day. And that, she knew now, was the most powerful story of all. As she turned back into her apartment, closing the balcony door behind her, Jessica smiled, not for anyone else, but for the woman she had finally become.